The mainstream media has made it crystal clear that they do not like Bernie Sanders and they want to defeat Bernie Sanders. Now, what are they doing to try to defeat Bernie Sanders? Well, they're just pretending like he doesn't exist. And the ways that they are ignoring him are so conspicuous, so brazen, that their agenda is crystal clear. They are trying to erase Bernie Sanders from the 2020 race. And throughout the course of this video, I'm hopefully going to demonstrate to you that this is pretty painfully obvious. Now, in case you don't know, for those of you who only watch the mainstream media, Bernie Sanders is in fact surging currently, contrary to popular belief. When you look at Real Clear Politics polling averages, he's on the rise and nearly closed the gap between him and Elizabeth Warren. He also surpasses all other candidates when it comes to voter enthusiasm, with 52% of his supporters extremely excited to vote for him and 61% definitely voting for him. A new Monmouth poll found that he's far ahead of Biden and Warren when it comes to youth voters, and also a new Reuters Ipsos poll found that voters view him as the best candidate on healthcare, the economy and jobs, immigration, and the environment. So make no mistake about it, the Bernie Sanders surge is real, but you wouldn't know about that if you watched the mainstream media, because what they're choosing to talk about is the surge of Pete Buttigieg, who on average is polling at 7%. So he's in fourth place. Now, there's been a couple of recent polls that show him doing well in early primary states, but overall, there's been endless coverage of Pete Buttigieg praising him with comparisons to Obama on CNN and MSNBC, and they also are praising Warren because they're trying to pitch her as the go-to alternative for progressives during the Democratic Party primary, because of course they don't want Bernie Sanders to win because he's the worst in their view. And when it comes to Pete Buttigieg, the reason why the media is trying to prop him up is because he's their backup plan in the likely event that Joe Biden does fail. Now, the reason why this matters, the reason why them ignoring Bernie Sanders matters, is because this has a real substantial impact on the state of the race. So if you read any social science research on the mainstream media and the effect that they have agenda-setting powers. They have the ability to raise the salience of particular issues in your mind that they think is more important. And on top of that, they have the ability to unilaterally pick and choose winners and losers in elections simply by covering them a lot or not covering them. Donald Trump is president largely because the media gave him $2 billion with a B of free advertising. And even if that coverage was negative, just the mere fact that they talked about him so much made it seem as if he was a legitimate candidate and a legitimate contender when he was a clown, not to be taken seriously. But since the media covered him because they prioritized their ratings over the country, well, that's the situation that we're currently in, largely due to the mainstream media. Now, Bernie Sanders is someone who they're trying to defeat by ignoring him, because if they don't talk about Bernie Sanders, then psychologically speaking, individuals who don't hear as much about Bernie Sanders from the mainstream media will just automatically assume that Bernie Sanders isn't a real contender, when he very much is in fact a contender. And when he's surging, that's when they should be theoretically talking about him the most, if they were actually fair and balanced. But we know that they're not. But by ignoring Bernie Sanders and trying to erase him from this entire election cycle, they are misinforming their viewers. And there are various examples, and by the time we're done with this video, you're going to see that there's no way that this is coincidental. It's not coincidental. So journalist Ryan Grimm points out how CNN cited a poll from New Hampshire where the results are flipped. So if you look at the poll on the right side of the screen, it shows that Warren is at 21% and Sanders is at 18%. But in actuality, it's Warren who's the one that's at 18% and Sanders who's at 21%. In other words, he's beating her, but that's not the way that they presented that information, and presumably they have issued 0 corrections thus far. Now, on top of that, Ryan Grimm tweeted, CNN has 5 articles up about its new New Hampshire poll that shows Sanders in front, yet none of the 5 say that in the headline. For example, Buttigieg in 4th, but a strong 4th. Another example of a headline, this is a historically unprecedented New Hampshire mess. Early state primary voters much more undecided than voters nationally. On top of that, there's this one, a disappointing poll for Biden. And the most charitable out of all of these, Sanders and Warren sit at top in New Hampshire, but there's no clear frontrunner. Now let me remind you, these are all headlines that are citing a poll that found out that Bernie Sanders was in fact in first place. But that's not all, because on top of that, Twitter user JB3 points out CNN's headline from the same poll where Bernie is 3 points ahead of Warren includes a banner that says, "No clear leader." No clear leader, when he clearly is in the lead. Now, on top of that, journalist Ken Klippenstein points out that this New York Times notification completely ignores the existence of Bernie Sanders. It says, Elizabeth Warren is leading a tight Iowa caucus race according to our new poll, while Pete Buttigieg is surging and Joe Biden is fading. They completely left out Bernie Sanders. Now, when you look at that actual poll, you'll see that Bernie Sanders is in second place. No mention of a Sanders surge or the fact that he's in second place. They reference Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, and Joe Biden, make no mention of Bernie Sanders whatsoever. Now, CNN reported on that poll with a lower third that talks about how Biden and Buttigieg are in striking distance of Warren, but no mention of Bernie Sanders. On top of that, this tweet from Lorraine, who shares a screenshot from MSNBC, completely excludes Bernie Sanders from their list of presidential contenders, even though they included Michael Bennett and Marianne Williamson, who are both polling at 0.5 and 0.4% respectively. No mention of Bernie there. And Lorraine also brings attention to this CNN lower third where it reads, Warren outpaces Biden in third quarter fundraising. Now, as you can see, Bernie came in first and he also outpaced Biden. No mention of Bernie Sanders in that lower third. And let's not forget about the Washington Post, because as Dr. James Zogby pointed out on Twitter, the Washington Post reported on a poll where it finds that voters say Bernie best understands the problems of ordinary people. But in spite of that, the headline reads, quote, as Warren and Buttigieg rise, the Democratic presidential race is competitive and fluid, a Washington Post ABC News poll finds. Again, Bernie was at the top of all three questions, while Buttigieg was in fourth, yet he's in the headline about this poll. So you get the point. Those are just a few examples, but if I wanted to, I could go on and on and on and on about all of the instances where a corporate-owned news outlet is very conspicuously trying to erase Bernie Sanders by not mentioning that he even is running for president anymore. None of this is coincidental. None of it. This is a concerted effort by corporate-owned news outlets to erase Bernie Sanders because he's a threat and they don't like him. Do you honestly believe that these journalists in corporate media are not aware of the influence that they have? Do you think that they don't know about the agenda-setting powers and their ability to pick winners and losers simply by either ignoring a candidate completely or over-covering them? They know about this social science research. They're aware of that. They're smart people. So this is all intentional. You can say maybe a couple mistakes here and there. That's understandable. But we're seeing time and again them try to erase Bernie Sanders from the conversation. And they're doing this at a time when he's surging, which is when there would be potentially more momentum for him, because the reason why they keep telling you about the Buttigieg surge is because they want you to get behind Buttigieg. If you see that he's the candidate with all of the momentum now, then maybe you should back him if you truly want to beat Donald Trump. Because what a lot of voters do, and perhaps even unintentionally, is they just kind of gravitate towards the candidate who they think has the best chance at winning. I don't know why people do that, but if you're just kind of a casual political observer, oftentimes you do this. Media knows this. And that's why they're trying to ignore Bernie Sanders so you don't even think he's an option. Now, thankfully, Bernie Sanders' team, namely David Sirota, has spoken out about this, and they've called out what is obviously a Bernie blackout. And even in the coverage of the Bernie blackout, the tone that journalists use to describe it pretty much prove the point. They don't like Bernie Sanders. Take this article from The Hill, for example, written by Jonathan Easley and Max Greenwood. Quote, Senator Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign is accusing the media of ignoring his quote-unquote surge in the polls. That quotation there is pretty telling. As the Vermont Independent looks to stage a comeback. Sanders has jumped in new surveys of New Hampshire with the latest CNN University of New Hampshire poll, finding him with the lead in the Granite State, which he won with 60% of the vote in the 2016 Democratic presidential primary. Sanders has also seen a small bump in some national polls and surveys of Iowa, although he does not lead anywhere else. Now, keep in mind, these are two very key primary states that are the reason why they're citing Pete Buttigieg as surging because he's doing well in these early primary states, so far, according to some polls. They go on, the Sanders campaign is fuming at the media, alleging the political press is playing favorites, particularly with Senator Elizabeth Warren and South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who for weeks have won headlines about how their campaigns are rising in the stretch run to Iowa. Sanders speechwriter David Sirota, whose daily newsletter is a reflection of the campaign's thinking, collected examples of alleged media bias and polling misrepresentations in his latest issue, underscored by a headline from the satirical news website The Onion about how Sanders had plummeted 2 points up in a new poll. In the last week, a wave of polls has emerged, showing a genuine full-on Bernie surge, but you might not know that if you tune into cable TV or read the headlines from the National Press Corps, Sirota wrote. In fact, you might not even know Bernie is running for president, and that is intentional. These media elites know, they're smart people. They know that if they truly want to defeat Bernie Sanders, what is more effective than smearing him is to just ignore him, pretend like he doesn't exist. Now, we know that this is true because Fox News actually talks about Bernie Sanders pretty frequently. Now, 100% of their coverage of Bernie Sanders is negative, but Fox News viewers, according to one recent survey, are more likely to support Bernie Sanders than MSNBC voters. So it goes to show you that ignoring a candidate is more powerful than smearing them nonstop. They're aware of this. They know what they're doing. This is not a coincidence. The Bernie blackout is real, and the corporate media is trying to do whatever they possibly can to put their finger on the scale for anyone but Bernie Sanders. Buttigieg is the alternative to Biden in the event he loses, and Warren is someone who they're trying to shove down our throats as the alternative to Bernie Sanders for progressives. They want you to think there's one option if you're progressive. It's Elizabeth Warren, not Bernie Sanders. But that's not true. But the sad news for them is that in spite of what they're doing to tip the scales against Bernie, he still might win. Because when he had zero national name recognition in 2016, he still overcame, a 60-point deficit nationally? So it's possible that we can still win. But in the event, there was this scenario where the media actually gave nonstop fun and coverage to Bernie Sanders, there would be no doubt in my mind he would lead by 10 points in the polls. Because the media has a lot of influence. And when you are someone with more than 1 million volunteers, you've raised more money than anyone else running for president, taking small grassroots dollar donations, when you have an entire movement behind you, that's powerful. If they reported on that in a fair and objective way, it'd be no competition. Bernie would be the front runner. But that's not the world that we live in. And if we want him to win, then we have to fight. And they're not going to change. They're still going to continue to ignore Bernie Sanders regardless. He could pull 20 points ahead of Joe Biden. That doesn't matter. They're always going to ignore Bernie Sanders and write him off and never give him the credit that he deserves because he's a threat. So why would they? These are mostly wealthy, privileged people who realize that Bernie Sanders' policies would affect them the most. They don't want a wealth tax. They don't want their taxes to go up. So they're trying to crush the individual out of self-interest who would best represent the American people. And that's a sad fact of reality, and it's why I would encourage everyone to read this book by Noam Chomsky, Manufacturing Consent, because everything he said in here is 100% accurate. I'll leave that there.